It's the week ending Saturday the 10th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen President Trump returning to the White House after 3 days in hospital with COVID-19, Cineworld announcing the temporary closure of 127 UK cinemas, and the deaths of reggae legend Johnny Nash and the Mozart of rock guitar, Eddie Van Halen. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari, Wilkin, and the boss man, Holden Frith. And I'm also pleased to say we have a new kid on the block too, freelance journalist Abdul Tahhan. Welcome to the show, Abdul.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a fun fact about yourself we could not discover on Google.
I am bald and my mum wants me to have a hair transplant, and I refuse.
Perfect. Now we all have an image. Holden, you're starting the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is it time to stand up and step forward?
Clemson University Police participating in a national training program that promotes bystander intervention. The school's police chief, former Charleston chief, Greg Mullins, says being an active bystander means saving someone from themselves when they're about to or are doing something that they shouldn't. Clemson University's police department, one of the first to participate in the Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement, or ABLE project.
Part of a report from WCBD News 2 earlier this week. Holden, what's the story?
The police department we just heard about in South Carolina is one of a growing number of American police forces that are promoting the concept of active or heroic bystanders in an attempt to prevent police brutality and really change the whole culture of policing. Another police force in Washington state signed up earlier this week. These two joined more than 30 who are now enrolled in a program promoted by a man called Dr. Irvin Staub, whose life story helps to explain why he thinks it's so important for people on the sidelines to get involved.
Yeah, before we talk about the ethical policing campaign that they're running, just tell us a bit about Dr. Staub's motivations for doing this, because he's had a very interesting life.
Yeah, he has, and it really stems from his birth and the circumstances around it. He's Jewish. He was born in Hungary just before World War II. And when the Nazis invaded, he would almost certainly have ended up in a death camp if it hadn't been for the intervention of strangers. In particular, there was a woman called Maria Goguen who essentially hid him and his sister in her own family. That's obviously quite a dramatic intervention, but there were other smaller and equally significant ones along the way. A diplomat who provided false papers, a neighbour who defended Mrs. Goguen against a Nazi gang which suspected her of shielding Jews. This was clearly a formative influence on him, and after the war, having lived in communist Hungary for a decade, he then escaped to the US. He studied the psychology of violence and genocide at Stanford University, and then more recently he's evolved that research really into police brutality and how the experiences of his childhood could be refined in order to tackle that problem.
Talk me through that then, because the heroic bystander concept, you can understand, is essentially the Good Samaritan, isn't it, based on his experiences. How does that translate into a police officer who is a trained, badged, uniformed police officer doing something different? They're already supposed to be in a heroic position.
They are, but clearly from the stories we've had this year and many years before, not all live up to that goal. And I think part of it is actually about trying to reframe the idea of just being a decent human being as something more active and heroic, and perhaps to help those sorts of ideas take root in what may be a masculine or an overtly, even potentially a violent and out of control police department. If you can frame just being a good person as being an active or heroic bystander, that sounds much more impressive than the idea perhaps of snitching on your colleagues or going against the culture of an organisation.
So the training is called Ethical Policing is Courageous, or EPIC is the acronym. Kari, I know you haven't been on the training course, but what have you deduced that it involves?
Basically, this EPIC training was actually first introduced in the New Orleans force in 2014, and that was 2 years after this New Orleans force had been brought under federal supervision because of decades of accusations of widespread corruption and violence. It's described as an officer survival program, a community safety program, and a job satisfaction program. Just getting back to basics, breaking that blue wall of silence and encouraging officers to intervene if they see misconduct in their own ranks. Based on the New Orleans pilot, if you like, it does seem to have been successful to some degree. There was a report last year by an independent police monitor that found that critical incidents involving the use of force by New Orleans officers had fallen from 22 in 2012 to 5 in 2018. So it is getting results, but obviously it's one solution to a much wider problem.
This is it. Viewed from 2020, Abdul, whatever's been happening in 2018 and 2019 is less relevant because you look at the various deaths of African Americans at the hands of US police this year, and it's understandable to think one way to avoid that kind of scenario is better police training. If the cop standing alongside the police officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck had intervened, then maybe that man wouldn't have died. But really, a lot of people think those deaths are the product of embedded racism across an institution. And so could this kind of thing really make a difference? Is it just window dressing?
I'm very skeptical about police behavior. Like, I come from Syria and I've seen police misbehavior in front of me unfolded. And it's very difficult to see any kind of ethical policing, especially if you watch the film The Departed back in 2006. There's a very famous line where Leonardo DiCaprio, an officer undercover, tells his psychologist that those police officers signed up to use their weapons. I know this is a film, this is Hollywood, but I do believe that these kids, when they sign up to become police officers, they want to be heroic. They want to use this force. And I've seen it unfolded in Syria whenever there are a lot of a lot of university kids never carried arms before. They were very good people. They're very nice human beings. Some of them were my friends. And once they carry out weapons, they're completely different people. They're like monsters. I'm not saying that all police are monsters, but carrying out weapons definitely helps how you view things. And if your friends, if act in a certain way, you're not really going to stop them and go against them. This is not something in NGOs. If you see misbehavior in NGO and then you try to stop it or raise the alarm, you get penalized for it. So imagine if you're doing it against your fellow cops.
It is being said to work, Holden.
It is, and I think it is. It's definitely an attempt to respond to precisely that problem, I think. The idea that once you give somebody a weapon, you give authority to somebody to use violence, that amongst some people there may be a tendency to abuse that. And I think it's based on the assumption, which I hope would be true, that there are also decent people within any situation who perhaps do want to intervene but haven't felt empowered to do. And these programs really seem designed to apply kind of positive peer pressure, really, and give those people who might feel that there's something going wrong and feel that they do want to uphold a standard of policing that's higher than the one that Abdul has just outlined. And there does seem to be some evidence that it is having that effect.
And outside of policing, because obviously this then starts a whole conversation about intervention, basically doing the right thing. You're a parent, Kari, so am I. Should we be teaching our kids to be heroic, active bystanders? Because it's all a very good philosophy, isn't it? But I mean, crucially, in the story of the Good Samaritan, no one is beating up the guy at the time he's been rescued. Should you be intervening because you're putting your safety at risk? And is that a great thing to tell our children to do?
It's a very difficult one, isn't it? Trying to teach those morals while keeping your children safe. And we should all take responsibility for maintaining safe communities. It's our civil duty. But most people don't have the skills to intervene safely. They may just get hurt. They may obstruct rescue attempts. So obviously it varies in every situation and people have to make judgments very quickly, which may sometimes be wrong. I was actually reading about something called the bystander effect, which researchers found that the more people who are present at an incident, the less likely people are to help someone in distress, either because that's that kind of sense of shifting of responsibility or fear of social embarrassment that maybe you've misread the situation or whatever. But yeah, I would still encourage my kids to intervene. On the other hand, just this week, we're seeing reports coming out of America about an African-American man called Jonathan Price, a 31-year-old man who was tasered and shot dead by police in Texas last weekend after reportedly stepping in to try and stop a man assaulting a woman in a petrol station. I don't have any clear answer.
Holden?
I think one of the reasons I brought this story is it did feel like that there had been more of a shift towards the idea of intervention whether it's just amongst members of the public or in terms of even filming is a form of intervention. But I think if you go back a few years, the advice would always be don't get involved, call us out, keep yourself safe. Whereas I think there has now been a sort of much more of a tentative approach towards intervening when you see something is wrong, the sense that taking action is a kind of public responsibility and a public duty. And although this is always very finely balanced, and there's the advice is, clearly you have to be mindful of putting yourself in danger, there's much more of a sense that everyone has to play a part rather than just leaving it to somebody else to sort out problems.
Yeah, some countries do actually have a legal duty to assist. In Quebec, for example, there's a Charter of Human Rights in the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms states that every person must come to the aid of anyone whose life is in peril, either personally or calling for aid, unless it involves dangers to himself or a third person, or he has another valid reason. And there are similar laws in Brazil and Germany. Some lawmakers do believe that people should have a legal duty to intervene.
And in terms of the police, finally, on this, I suppose it has to be welcome, whether it works or not, whether we're cynical about it or not, Abdul, it has to be welcome, doesn't it, that part of police training now might be, we know you're trained to protect your fellow officers above everyone else, even above the public, but actually being loyal to your fellow officers does include telling them when they're doing something wrong.
Oh, providing training is great, of course, but thinking that peer pressure is going to solve it, I don't think so, because we don't really like peer pressure, generally speaking, in any society, right? But of course, having the training maybe would help for the new kids that are enrolling now.
Yeah, the other way in which it's been used in a form of training is at several UK universities, which in their sort of Freshers' Week orientation are giving new students a kind of active bystander training to try and get them to intervene if they see their friends involved in sort of low-level sexual harassment, so they can have the confidence to speak to friends, acquaintances, even strangers, in a non-confrontational way to try and set them right before problems develop. And this does seem to be a broader trend amongst universities of trying to get people to speak up and speak out in situations where they might previously have just decided to keep quiet.
Okay, fascinating. Kari, you're up next after this. Okay, Kari, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is Banksy's Monet really just all about the money?
Could this be a rare sighting of the elusive street artist Banksy? Undercover, making a special delivery to University Hospital Southampton.
Wow.
It's certainly his handiwork. It was hung late last night and unveiled this morning. It depicts a young boy kneeling down wearing dungarees and a white T-shirt. A waste paper basket in front of him has two discarded old superheroes. Instead, he's playing with his new model figure, a new superhero, an NHS nurse with a flying cape and arm pointing forwards, like Superman. She is on a mission. The idea of the hospital's management and Banksy was to thank the staff of the NHS generally for everything they are doing. So, did it go down well?
Will Gompertz reporting for BBC News earlier this year. So it's a Banksy story, is it, Kari? What's been going on this week?
Yeah, he's certainly going down with art investors. There's a sale coming up of his 2005 painting, Show Me the Monet, which is going under the hammer later this month. And it's got an upper estimate of £5 million, but it's actually tipped to exceed the record £9.9 million paid for one of the street artist's works last year. And this follows recent sales of his prints at Christie's and Sotheby's, where almost every lot smashed estimates. Christie's alone, there were 21 lots that made a total of 2.1 million.
Okay, so Show Me the Monet is his parody, isn't it, of the Water Lilies painting by Claude Monet, and he's put like a shopping trolley in the river and a bobbing traffic cone. It's quite funny. The title's quite funny. He's a well-renowned artist. And what, you'd expect it to go for big money? Why is this your story of the week?
Pundits, they say that this painting, it's a comment on society's disregard for the environment in favour of the wasteful excesses of consumerism. But I would argue that the fact that this criticism of consumerism is, tipped to get almost over £10 million when it goes under the sale, it highlights this growing commercialisation of urban art. I think it's a pivotal moment for the art world. Urban art has changed the way that the traditional art market works. Artists can represent their work directly to a wider audience on the internet while expressing views without official sanction. But at the same time, they then enter the mainstream they're criticising. And I think Banksy personifies this dilemma of basically this commercialisation essentially severing the genre's anti-establishment roots and message.
But how can you point to an example of how Banksy's actually been compromised? He is commercial and he is anti-establishment. That's true, isn't it?
To be fair, I think he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He's a victim of his own success, if you like, but I think he's also in danger of becoming a parody of himself. This is the man, we presume, we don't actually know his identity, who once wrote on a wall that copyright is for losers, for example, and yet he's just been embroiled in an ongoing trademark dispute with the EU, for example, and he actually last month just lost that trademark dispute. It was with a greeting card company over the use of his flower throw image known as Love is in the Air, which was painted in Bethlehem. And in fact, the EU Intellectual Property Office ruled against him, saying that he can't be identified as the unquestionable owner of the work because his identity is hidden and because he'd painted it on someone else's property. But it does, on the one hand, he's all anti-establishment. On the other hand, he's trying to copyright his work and make money from it, which in itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But it does seem to be a lot of contradictions going on here.
Abdul, do you agree Banksy's a hypocrite? He shouldn't be in a position to criticise capitalism if he's raking in so much money.
As long as he's paying taxes on his money he's making, I don't care. Like, he can do whatever he wants.
It's hard to blame him for trying to make money, but I think there is an irony in the fact that he's not only selling these works for large amounts of money, but then there's a huge resale value attached to a lot of them. So the super wealthy people who bought them in the first place are then able to enrich themselves yet further on the proceeds of the anti-capitalist propaganda they purchased at huge price. So it's definitely, I don't think you can necessarily blame Banksy himself for it, but it's certainly, maybe that in itself is a piece of conceptual art and we're all complicit in it.
Again, I don't really understand this art, and I don't understand how can someone be this famous and stay, nobody knows who he is.
I think that is an interesting part of this whole story is actually he has been unmasked quite convincingly quite a few times, and part of the way that journalists have been able to track him down is through his movements around the country. And school friends have corroborated the main theory. But there's almost I think people like the story of the anonymous artist who just arrives, creates a work, disappears. There's a reluctance on everyone's part to give up the idea of his anonymity, except perhaps now from him. It is getting in the way of protecting the brand that's based itself on anonymity. But part of the trademark dispute was the fact that because it is harder to authenticate an anonymous work of art, it's easier to pass off other people's works and make money off the back of it. He obviously doesn't want that to happen, but without him coming forward and identifying himself, it's harder to defend.
But the whole thing of his identity is a bit of a red herring, isn't it? And we're falling into the trap ourselves now. We're talking about it because it is an irresistible subject and people love to discuss it, but we're supposed to be discussing whether or not he's a hypocrite for now being part of the establishment. And actually, that's the answer, isn't it? Exactly as Holden said, he's a brand, Kari. Like, whether or not he's a hypocrite for making money, he's transcended art and become a brand. And really, the reason this should be your story of the week isn't because he's a hypocrite, but because he's showing, in the week that our Chancellor said to various creatives, look, go and retrain and do something else because you're not going to make money doing what you do, he's showing how you can make money out of creativity. It's become a brand. Don't just be an artist anymore.
I was just getting to this point. Yeah, I do argue that we've always had celebrity artists. Warhol goes back years and years. But I think what's different now is that contemporary artists are being forced to become brands, largely as a result of social media and the internet. You're no longer selling your work so much as selling yourself. And I think that's what's really changed, that you have to become this persona. And it does ultimately detract from the art. And I think that's a real shame that it can't be, at the risk of sounding wanky, that it can't just be about the art.
But does it detract from the art, Abdul? Because you made reference to one of Banksy's works in Bethlehem. He's done work in Gaza and so on. Most people listening to this aren't going to see the one he's done in Brick Lane, never mind the one he's done in Gaza, in person. The point is that you see it on the internet. It doesn't matter whether you see it in person.
It is irrelevant. At the end of the day, you see something. For me, I can never tell if this is Banksy or not. I can only tell if other people tell me, oh, this is Banksy. But I have no way to find out for sure if this is the person, if it's a he or a she or they or whoever they identify with. But for me, I don't know. I don't find it any interesting. I don't understand the value that a lot of people want to collect it for and invest in it. But fortunately enough, I can never even afford 1 centimeter of his art. So I'm not going to get concerned in this.
If John Stepek was here, I'd be posing this question to him. But since he's not, Holden, you'll have to do. From an investment point of view, Abdul says he doesn't see the point, but actually it does now seem to be a pretty safe bet, doesn't it? Even at £10 million, Banksy clearly is still going to be, it's going to be worth £50 million in 50 years' time, isn't it?
It does, as long as you have confidence that what you've bought really is a Banksy and he does have a system of authenticating these works, then yeah, it seems that this is an investment that's going to grow, certainly far more than if you put your money in a savings account for 0.4%.
There was that very well publicised incident in 2018 when his girl with balloon painting was destroyed by a shredder that was allegedly secretly hidden in the frame moments after selling for £1 million at Sotheby's in London. People said, oh, it's Banksy at his anti-establishment best, whereas actually there's also theories that it was a money-making stunt because, as experts pointed out, the work, even in its shredded state, was probably worth more than £2 million because of all the publicity surrounding it. So yeah, you can't go wrong. You shred your Banksy and you're still making money.
On which, Abdul, you're up next after this. Abdul, you are finishing the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is it time virtue signaling took a walk?
It seemed to me that it would be quite easy to get enamoured and enthused by doing endless tours of the frock in different places, but actually the whole reason to do it was that I was trying to find what my part in all of this might be. So I've begun to think of her as the flag, really, and behind the flag are these other things that are starting to emerge. I had a meeting with UNHCR after St Pancras, and we were talking about where the project could go next, and I said I'd very much like to go to Zaatari to understand really what all this is about.
Designer and artist Helen Story talking about the Dress for Our Time back in 2016. Abdul, remind us briefly what that was and then tell us what's happened this week.
So that was a wedding dress made out of a tent. It's a refugee tent from the UN, taken from one of the refugee camps in Jordan. It's called The Dress of Our Time, and it was showcased in London in 2016.
And this week you've spotted a parallel story.
Yeah, those people don't really learn, do they? There is a giant puppet going to make a walk of 5,000 miles all the way from the Syrian-Turkish borders in Turkey all the way to Manchester. The puppet is 3.5 meters tall. And it was made by the Warhorse people. And these are the same people, I think, who took the jungle to the stage in Calais. And this puppet is supposed to be celebrating the asylum takers, the journey of the asylum takers all the way from Turkey to England. It's going to be, as they say, it's a walking festival of art. And it should arrive in Manchester next July.
So when you say these people never learn and you draw these two stories together, well-meaning artists wanting to reflect stories of refugees in their art, what are they getting wrong?
They're getting a lot of things wrong, but I am a refugee myself, and I do not see this as a celebration. This journey is a deadly journey. This is not something light. This is not a festival of art and work. This is a survival or not. Hundreds, if not thousands of people have died so far doing this. This is not an option. But for a lot of these artists, they want to make a name for themselves. They think that this is a good thing for refugees, so they go ahead and do it. It reminds me in 2014 and 2015, during or 2016 as well, during the height of the refugee crisis in Europe, where a lot of tech companies started designing these applications for refugees or for the asylum seekers to use. They even had a conference for it. It's called, I think, Techfugees or something. And a lot of applications were just invented in vain.
Kari, we've just been talking about Banksy and the purpose of public art, and artists want to make work about contemporary crises so that their work reflects the world that they're in. If we take the criticism that Abdul's making on board, then you're saying to artists, don't tackle these subjects at all, aren't you?
I think it's a lot of it is, as Abdul was saying, it's about how you tackle it. You're representing refugees as a puppet, and a lot of it is the language surrounding it. This puppet, it's meant to represent a child called Little Amal. It's just, even that name is cloying. So much of the language around it. One of the people involved in this is Billy Elliot director Stephen Daldry, and again, I'm sure the intentions are very good, but he says it's perhaps the most ambitious public art project ever attempted, and it just smacks of egotism. And as Abdul was saying, this isn't an art project. If what you're saying is this is about raising awareness, don't start banging on about the artistic value of what you're doing.
But it is raising awareness, isn't it, Holden? Because here we are talking about it. And the intended audience with respect to Abdul isn't refugees. The intended audience is the kind of people that pay to go to the theatre in London who are going to see pictures of this and think, there's a refugee crisis. I'm thinking about that now.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that sometimes raising awareness can be a valuable project and a valuable goal. But in this particular case, it doesn't really seem that awareness is the problem. Even if your selected audience was a London theatre crowd, those are people who I would imagine would mostly be already on board with a more compassionate view of, or even just a more complex view of the refugee crisis. It seems that the underlying issues are visceral here, ranging from war in Syria, insecurity in the Middle East more broadly, fear of immigration in Europe, and even then the kind of geopolitical side of, the relationship between the EU and Turkey and the deals that have been done there. It's hard to know where to start, but I'm not sure walking a puppet across Europe is the right place.
I'm waiting for the phone in, Abdul, where we find out whether the puppet should have sought refuge in France rather than coming all the way to Manchester. But I suppose the thing is, if it is celebrated, which is what the artists are saying will happen, if lots of people take a photo, for example, of this giant puppet marching its way through Eastern Europe, then the natural conversation that flows from that is the one you're saying, isn't it? It is the one that says, look at the disparity between how this puppet is being greeted and how real people are being greeted. And that is the artistic point of it.
Oh, yeah, of course. Nigel Farage is just waiting for this puppet to arrive to change all his position on refugee crisis. Once he sees it, he's going to go open the borders. He's like, welcome refugees. This doesn't make any sense. This doesn't change anything. People in the camps are still going to be living in a very bad conditions. People in England who seek asylum are still going to have a lot of difficulties integrating into this society. Asylum seekers are still going to be facing very long times until they get interviewed. But sure, let's celebrate someone who got funded with a lot of money to make a huge doll and call it Little Amel.
Can awareness be done correctly then? You've got budget for an art project, however much this costs. Let's say I've given you whatever it is, £200,000. What would you do with it? And don't say give it to refugees, because of course that's an option. I'm saying if you're spending the money on art, what do you do with it?
So the right way to do it is to support initiative out there that help in changing the narrative of the refugee crisis by empowering refugees themselves to report on their stories. And there are a lot of these initiatives, like the Phosphorus Theatre Company, which has the Pizza Shop play, which actually is played and written by refugees who came to the country. There is the Refugee Journalism Project, which actually support refugees who are journalists and want to change the quality of reporting. So there are a lot of things that people can do, but raising awareness in 2020 about refugee crisis, that's been happening for ages, and it keeps appearing every day. Every few months, it makes a comeback. I don't think this is the right way.
And doing it in such a celebrity-driven way, you look at all of the reports about this. It's Warhorse creators, it's Stephen Daldry, it's all of this emphasis on look at the famous people at the front of it. It's surely that is shifting the focus away from what it's meant to be about. And in fact, it's interesting that there's been research that's shown in the past that celebrity-fronted awareness campaigns don't work. There was a 2014 paper which found that of 2/3 of 2,000 people who were quizzed in surveys were unable to link a list of stars with the charities they support. And it's been found time and again that most people decide which charities or causes to support, but according to their own personal connections in their lives and families. So I don't think that people are going to go, oh, it's the Warhorse creators, we're definitely going to start caring about immigrants now. It seems unlikely.
It is an irresistible image, though, isn't it, Holden? And you're a digital editor. When we see this picture of this giant puppet crossing at Calais, we're going to want to click that image.
We are, but it is a striking image, but I think it's almost a Dickensian image, and it plays into that idea of the sort of pure, virtuous, piteous hero who's acceptable because she's powerless. And I think that's part of the problem with this narrative, which perhaps it's part of the problem which maybe the artwork is attempting to address the idea of asylum seekers as a threat, but in doing so they've gone to the opposite ends of the spectrum, and so you still have this sort of binary relationship between threat and pity, and people can't just be humans.
Maybe they should just invest the money in a Banksy instead. That is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. Big thanks to Kari, Holden, and our new boy, Abdul. And if you're a collector of art, then surely you should be downloading our entire back catalogue. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. And like stumbling across a Banksy, it's free. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.